The bench outside the homeless shelter felt colder than usual that November evening. David sat there with his head in his hands, trying to figure out how his life had spiraled so far out of control in just 3 months. In his pocket, he had exactly $8.35. That was it. That was all that stood between him and absolute rock bottom. He pulled out the crumpled bills and counted them again, as if somehow the amount would magically increase. It didn't. The coins clinked softly as he turned them over in his palm. 3 months ago, he'd had a decent job as a supervisor at a distribution warehouse. Nothing fancy, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table. Then the company downsized and his position was eliminated. Just like that, 16 years of loyalty meant nothing. At first, David thought he'd find something quickly. He had experience, good references, and a solid work ethic, but the job market was tougher than he'd expected. Weeks turned into months. His unemployment benefits helped, but they weren't enough to cover everything. And then his daughter got sick. Little Lily was only 9 years old when the doctors found the tumor. Benign, they said, but it needed to be removed. The surgery was expensive. The follow-up treatments were expensive. Even with insurance, the bills piled up faster than he could manage. David had drained his savings account, maxed out his credit cards, and borrowed from everyone he knew. His sister had taken Lily in temporarily, giving her a stable place to stay while David tried to sort out the mess his life had become. The eviction notice had come last week. He had 7 days to pay 3 months of back rent or get out. Those 7 days were almost up. Tomorrow, everything he owned would probably end up on the sidewalk. The thought made his stomach turn, but not as much as the hunger did. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. Every dollar he scraped together went to Lily. His sister was doing her best, but she had 3 kids of her own. David couldn't expect her to feed his daughter indefinitely without helping out. A staff member from the shelter came out and handed him a meal voucher. "The diner across the street will take this," she said kindly. "1 full meal. You look like you could use it." David thanked her and stared at the voucher. His hands were shaking slightly. He wasn't sure if it was from hunger or from the overwhelming sense of failure that had been crushing him for weeks. He'd always been the one who took care of others. Now he couldn't even take care of himself. The walk across the street felt longer than it should have. Each step reminded him of how weak he'd become. When was the last time he'd eaten properly? He couldn't remember. The diner's neon sign buzzed overhead as he pushed open the door. The smell of coffee and fried food hit him immediately, making his mouth water and his stomach cramp with anticipation. Inside, the diner was about half full. Working people grabbing dinner after their shifts. Families with kids. Normal people living normal lives. David felt out of place in his worn clothes and scuffed shoes. He could see a few people glancing at him, then quickly looking away. He'd become invisible, just another struggling soul trying to survive. He slid into a booth near the window and studied the menu, even though the voucher would only cover the cheapest option. A basic sandwich and a bowl of soup. It wasn't much, but right now it felt like a feast. He tried not to think about how long it would need to last him. This might be his only real meal for days. The waitress came over, tired but friendly. David handed her the voucher and placed his order. She nodded and walked away without judgment, which he appreciated more than she could know. Being poor had taught him that simple kindness was rarer than it should be. While he waited, David watched the door. He wasn't expecting anyone. He just needed something to focus on besides his growling stomach and his racing thoughts. That's when he saw her. An old woman, probably in her 70s, shuffled through the door. Her clothes were clean but worn thin. She carried a small bag and moved with the careful steps of someone who'd learned to conserve their energy. She approached the counter with a hesitant smile. David couldn't hear exactly what she was saying, but he could read the situation clearly enough. She was asking for food, maybe just water and a piece of bread, something small, something cheap. The manager behind the counter shook his head. He didn't look mean about it, just resigned. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't give away food. It's company policy. I'd lose my job." The old woman nodded, understanding but clearly devastated. She thanked him quietly and turned toward the door. That's when David saw her face fully. The exhaustion, the defeat, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been fighting too long with too little. It was like looking in a mirror, except somehow her struggle felt even more unfair than his own. She reminded him of his mother. Not in looks exactly, but in the way she carried herself with dignity despite everything. His mother had worked 2 jobs to raise him and his sister after their father left. She'd never complained, never asked for help, and never let them see how hard things really were. She'd passed away 5 years ago, but David still thought about her every day. Especially lately, when he wondered what she'd think of the mess he'd made of his life. The old woman was almost to the door when David felt something shift inside him. He thought about his mother. He thought about Lily staying with his sister, probably wondering when her dad would get things together. He thought about all the times people had helped him along the way, even in small ways. The neighbor who'd paid for groceries when his card got declined. The former co-worker who'd slipped him $20 and pretended it was a loan. The shelter worker who'd just given him this meal voucher. His stomach was screaming at him. The logical part of his brain was screaming even louder. He needed this food. This was his only meal. He had nothing else. Giving it away would be stupid, reckless. He'd be even weaker tomorrow, even less able to handle whatever came next. But something stronger than logic or hunger was pulling at him. Maybe it was his mother's voice in his head, reminding him that being broke didn't mean being broken. Maybe it was the memory of every person who'd shown him kindness when they didn't have to. Or maybe it was just the desperate need to feel human again, to do something good in a world that felt like it had forgotten what good meant. Before he could talk himself out of it, David stood up. His legs felt unsteady, but his voice was clear. "Excuse me, ma'am." The old woman turned around, her hand on the door handle. Up close, David could see the lines of worry etched deep into her face. Her eyes were a soft brown, filled with a sadness that seemed to go beyond simple hunger. "Would you like to join me?" David heard himself say. "I've got food coming, and honestly, it's too much for just me. I'd appreciate the company." It wasn't entirely true. The sandwich and soup were exactly the right amount for someone who hadn't eaten in 2 days. But the lie felt necessary, like armor protecting both their dignities. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, I couldn't possibly." "That's very kind, but..." "Please," David interrupted gently. "I hate eating alone, really." There was a long moment where she studied his face, trying to determine if this was genuine or pity. David kept his expression open and friendly, the same look his mother used to give people when she wanted them to feel welcome. Finally, the old woman nodded and shuffled back to his booth. They sat across from each other in silence for a moment. David could see the shame and gratitude warring on her face. He knew that feeling. He'd been wearing it himself for months now. "I'm David," he said, extending his hand across the table. "Rose," she replied, her handshake surprisingly firm despite her frail appearance. The waitress brought over his order, a simple turkey sandwich and a bowl of vegetable soup. It looked beautiful. David's mouth watered just looking at it. Every instinct in his body was telling him to grab that sandwich and devour it before he did something stupid. Instead, he pushed the plate and bowl across the table to Rose. "Please help yourself." "But what about you?" Rose asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Oh, I had a late lunch," David lied smoothly. "I'm really not that hungry. But I can't stand to see food go to waste." It was another necessary lie, a small deception that preserved dignity on both sides. Rose looked like she wanted to protest further, but hunger won out. She picked up the sandwich with shaking hands and took a small, careful bite. The expression on her face nearly broke David's heart. It was pure relief mixed with something that looked almost like grief. As Rose ate, taking her time and savoring every bite, she began to talk. Rose ate slowly, like someone who'd learned to make food last. Between small bites of the sandwich, she told David her story. She'd been a school teacher for over 40 years. 4th grade. She loved those kids, she said, her eyes lighting up even through the exhaustion. Every single one of them. She'd retired 8 years ago with what she thought was a solid pension. Nothing extravagant, but enough to live on. Enough for a small apartment, groceries, maybe even a little vacation once a year. Then her financial advisor, someone she'd trusted for decades, disappeared with everything. Turned out the whole investment firm was a scam. By the time the authorities figured it out, the money was gone. Vanished into accounts in countries she'd never heard of. David listened, his own stomach cramping with hunger, but he stayed focused on her words. Rose had been too embarrassed to tell her children what had happened. They lived in different states, busy with their own families and careers. She didn't want to be a burden, so she'd quietly sold her furniture, let go of her apartment, and ended up living in her old Honda Civic, That was 6 months ago. I park in different places each night, Rose said softly, taking another small bite of soup. The library parking lot is good during the day. I can use the bathroom there, clean up a bit. At night, I try to find spots where the police won't bother me. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. She paused, her spoon hovering over the bowl. I never thought I'd end up here. I worked my whole life. I paid my taxes. I did everything right. And somehow here I am at 73 years old begging for bread in a diner. You weren't begging, David said firmly. You were asking. There's a difference. Rose smiled at that, a real smile that made her whole face change. You're kind to say so. But I know what I looked like. I saw the way that manager looked at me. Not mean, just tired of people like me. I don't blame him. He's probably got his own problems. David nodded. He understood that completely. Everyone was fighting their own battle. The manager wasn't a bad person for following policy. He was just trying to keep his own job in a world that didn't forgive mistakes. They talked for nearly an hour. Rose told him about her favorite students, the ones who'd gone on to become doctors and teachers themselves. She told him about her late husband, a mechanic who could fix anything with duct tape and determination. She'd lost him 10 years ago to a heart attack. Since then, life had been quieter, lonelier, and now impossibly harder. David found himself sharing too. About Lily and her surgery, about losing his job and watching his savings evaporate, about the eviction notice and the growing fear that he'd never get back on his feet. Something about Rose made it easy to talk. Maybe it was because they were both drowning in different ways, or maybe it was just nice to be seen as human again instead of invisible. When Rose finally finished eating, she looked more alive than when she'd walked in. Color had returned to her cheeks. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. She reached across the table and squeezed David's hand. "Thank you," she said. And her voice carried so much weight that David felt tears prick at his eyes. "You gave me more than food today. You gave me back a little bit of my dignity. You have no idea what that means," but David did know, because every time someone had shown him kindness over the past few months, he'd felt the same thing. That moment of being seen, of mattering, of being treated like a person instead of a problem. Rose gathered her small bag and stood to leave. She promised David she'd pay this forward somehow, someway. He believed her. She had that look about her, the kind of person who kept promises even when it cost them something. After she left, David sat alone in the booth. His stomach felt like it was eating itself. He'd told the waitress he didn't want anything else, sticking to his story about having eaten earlier. Now he regretted that lie. But what choice did he have? He couldn't exactly ask for food after giving his meal away. His pride wouldn't allow it. The waitress came by to clear the empty dishes. She gave David a knowing look. "That was a good thing you did," she said quietly. "I saw what happened. Not many people would have done that." David shrugged, embarrassed. "It was just a sandwich. Maybe to you," she replied. But I bet it meant the world to her. After she walked away, David realized he wasn't alone in the diner. Throughout his conversation with Rose, other diners had been coming and going. The dinner rush was starting to wind down, but one man had been sitting in the corner booth the entire time. David noticed him now, a guy in a business suit with a coffee cup and a mostly untouched piece of pie. The man was looking at him, not staring exactly, but definitely paying attention. David felt self-conscious. Had he been too loud? Was his appearance bothering other customers? He'd tried to stay clean, but without a regular place to shower, it was getting harder. The man stood up and walked over. David tensed, expecting trouble. Maybe this guy was going to complain to the manager. Maybe he'd suggest David find a different place to hang out. But when the man reached the booth, his expression was thoughtful, not hostile. "Excuse me," the man said. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I couldn't help noticing what you did for that lady." That was really something. David felt his face flush. It wasn't anything special, wasn't it? The man tilted his head slightly. "You gave away what looked like your only meal. I don't think that's nothing." There was an awkward pause. David didn't know what to say. He felt exposed, like this stranger had seen right through all his careful pretending. The man seemed to sense his discomfort. "I'm Robert, by the way," he said, extending his hand. "Robert Chen. And before you worry, I'm not here to make you uncomfortable. Actually, I was wondering if I could buy you dinner and talk with you for a few minutes. Would that be all right?" David blinked in surprise. This was not what he'd expected. I don't understand. Why would you want to do that? Robert smiled. Because I've been sitting in business meetings all week interviewing people for a job opening, and I just watched you conduct yourself with more character in 10 minutes than I've seen from anyone with a fancy resume and expensive suit. Call it curiosity, or maybe call it a hunch. Either way, I'd like to hear your story if you're willing to share it. David's mind raced. This felt surreal. Was this some kind of setup? Was Robert with social services or something? But the man's eyes seemed genuine, and honestly, David was too hungry and too tired to care if this was some weird trick. If nothing else, he'd get another meal out of it. Okay, David said finally. Sure, why not? Robert sat down across from him in the same spot Rose had occupied minutes before. The waitress came back over, and Robert ordered coffee for both of them plus a full dinner for David. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a slice of apple pie. It was more food than David had seen in weeks. While they waited for the order, Robert explained himself. He was the regional director for a manufacturing company called Chen Industries. They were opening a new facility in town and looking for someone to run it as plant manager. He'd been interviewing candidates all week, people with impressive backgrounds and years of experience. But here's the thing, Robert said, stirring sugar into his coffee. I can teach someone how to manage a production line. I can train them on our systems and processes. What I can't teach is character. I can't teach someone to care about people or to lead with integrity. Those are things you either have or you don't. David listened, not quite seeing where this was going. The food arrived, and he had to force himself not to attack it like a starving animal. He ate slowly, steadily, while Robert continued talking. What I saw you do tonight told me more about your leadership potential than any interview could, Robert said. You sacrificed something important for someone who needed it more. You did it without expecting anything in return. You treated that woman with respect and dignity when society had forgotten she existed. That's the kind of person I want running my facility. David nearly choked on his mashed potatoes. Wait, are you offering me a job? I'm interested in learning more about you, Robert said carefully. Tell me about your work experience. What did you do before? Well, before things got difficult? So David told him. About his 16 years at the distribution warehouse. About working his way up from loading dock to supervisor, about managing teams, solving logistics problems, and keeping operations running smoothly even when things got chaotic. He talked about his approach to leadership, which focused on treating people fairly and recognizing that everyone on the team mattered, from the executives to the janitors. Robert asked good questions. Not the usual interview stuff, but deeper things about how David handled conflict, how he motivated struggling employees, what he did when he made mistakes. They talked for over an hour, and somewhere during that conversation, David forgot to be hungry. He forgot to be ashamed. He just talked honestly and openly about who he was and what he believed in. Finally, Robert sat back and smiled. David, I'm going to be straight with you. I think you might be exactly what we need, but I want to do this right. Can you come by my office Monday morning? I'd like to discuss this opportunity properly. Maybe have you meet some of our team. Would that work for you? David's heart was pounding. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. Yes, I can do that. But I should be honest with you. I'm staying at a shelter right now. I don't have a car. My clothes are... I don't care about any of that. Robert interrupted gently. I care about who you are, not what you're wearing or where you're sleeping. We'll figure out the logistics. Right now, I just need to know if you're interested. I'm interested, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Very interested. Robert wrote down an address and handed it to David along with a business card. 9 o'clock Monday morning. And David, thank you for reminding me what really matters. David barely slept that night. He lay on his cot at the shelter, staring at the ceiling and replaying the conversation with Robert over and over in his mind. Part of him wondered if he'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe hunger had made him hallucinate. Maybe he'd wake up tomorrow and discover that business card was just a piece of trash he'd picked up off the street. But when morning came, the card was still real, solid and white with raised black letters. Robert Chen, Regional Director, Chen Industries, an address across town in the business district. It was real. All of it had been real. The weekend crawled by. Saturday and Sunday felt like the longest days of David's life. He used his remaining few dollars to do laundry at a coin-operated place near the shelter, washing his best remaining shirt and pants. They were worn and a little faded, but they were clean. He borrowed a razor from another guy at the shelter and shaved carefully. He did everything he could to look presentable. Sunday evening, he called his sister to check on Lily. His daughter's voice on the phone made his eyes water. She sounded good, healthy. She told him about a school project she was working on and asked when she could come home. David promised her soon, very soon. He hoped that wasn't another lie. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. David left the shelter early and started walking. The business district was nearly 5 miles away, but he'd budgeted extra time. His stomach was empty again. He hadn't eaten since that meal with Robert on Friday night, but nervous energy kept him moving. This was his shot, maybe his only shot. He couldn't mess it up. He arrived at the address with 20 minutes to spare. The building was nicer than he'd expected, all glass and steel with a modern lobby. David felt completely out of place. His clothes, even freshly washed, looked shabby against the polished floors and expensive furniture. The security guard at the front desk eyed him suspiciously. "Can I help you?" The guard's tone suggested he thought David was lost or possibly there to cause trouble. "I have an appointment with Robert Chen," David said, trying to sound confident. 9 o'clock. The guard's expression shifted from suspicious to skeptical. He picked up a phone and made a call. After a brief conversation, his whole demeanor changed. "Mr. Chen is expecting you. 10th floor, suite 1015. Elevators are to your right." David thanked him and headed for the elevators. His reflection in the polished door showed a man who looked tired and nervous but determined. He straightened his shoulders. Whatever happened in the next hour would change everything one way or another. The 10th floor was just as impressive as the lobby. Robert's office was at the end of a long hallway, lined with photos of manufacturing facilities and community events. A friendly receptionist greeted David and asked him to wait just a moment. She offered him coffee, which he accepted gratefully. It was good coffee, not the watery stuff from the shelter. Robert appeared a few minutes later, smiling warmly. He was dressed in business casual, less formal than Friday night. "David, glad you made it. Come on back." They walked past several offices until they reached a large conference room. Inside, 3 other people were already seated around a long table. Robert introduced them as key members of the management team. There was Patricia, the head of human resources, Kevin, the operations director, and Linda, who handled community relations. David's nervousness spiked. He'd thought this would just be another conversation with Robert. Instead, it was starting to feel like a real interview. Multiple people, a conference room. This was serious, but Robert put him at ease almost immediately. "Don't worry, this isn't an interrogation. I just wanted some of my team to meet you. They're the ones who'll be working with whoever takes this position, so their input matters. I've told them a bit about you. Now I'd like you to tell them in your own words about your experience." So David talked. He explained his background, his approach to management, his philosophy about treating people with respect. The questions that followed weren't the usual interview questions. Instead, they asked about specific situations. How would he handle a conflict between 2 employees? What would he do if production fell behind schedule? How did he balance company needs with employee well-being? David answered honestly. He didn't try to sound smarter than he was or pretend he knew things he didn't. When he didn't know something, he said so. When he'd made mistakes in the past, he admitted them and explained what he'd learned. Patricia asked him about his current situation. "Robert mentioned you've been going through some difficulties. Can you tell us about that?" David hesitated. This was the part he'd been dreading, but there was no point in lying. They'd find out eventually. "I lost my job 3 months ago. My daughter got sick and the medical bills wiped out my savings. I'm currently staying at a shelter while I try to get back on my feet." He waited for the judgment, the skepticism, the polite dismissal. Instead, Patricia nodded thoughtfully. "That must be incredibly difficult, especially with a young daughter. How old is she?" 9, she's staying with my sister temporarily. "And the medical situation?" Patricia asked gently. "She's doing better. The surgery went well. She just needs some follow-up treatments." Linda spoke up. "Robert told us what you did at the diner Friday night. Giving your meal to that elderly woman. That says a lot about your character." David felt his face flush. "It wasn't anything special. She needed it more than I did. I disagree, Kevin said. Most people wouldn't have done that, especially in your situation. It shows the kind of person you are when nobody's watching. Except I was watching, Robert added with a small smile. And that's why we're all here today. They talked for another hour. The conversation flowed naturally, moving from work topics to life experiences to values and priorities. David found himself relaxing despite the formal setting. These people weren't trying to trip him up or catch him in a lie. They genuinely seemed interested in understanding who he was. Finally, Robert stood up. David, would you mind stepping outside for just a few minutes? We need to confer amongst ourselves. The receptionist can get you more coffee if you'd like. David left the conference room, his heart pounding. This was it. They were making their decision. He sat in the waiting area, trying not to let his imagination run wild. Maybe they'd decided he was too risky. Maybe they were just being polite and would let him down gently. Maybe this whole thing had been too good to be true from the start. The minutes felt like hours. David watched the clock on the wall tick forward. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15. Finally, Robert opened the conference room door and gestured for David to come back in. Everyone was still seated around the table. Their expressions were serious, and David's stomach sank. He'd seen that look before. It was the look people got when they had to deliver bad news they didn't want to deliver. But then Patricia smiled. David, we'd like to offer you the position of plant manager. The words didn't quite register at first. David blinked. I'm sorry, what? The job is yours if you want it, Robert said. We've discussed it and we're all in agreement. You're exactly what we need for this facility. David felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. But, are you sure? There must be other candidates with more recent experience, better qualifications. Better qualifications on paper, maybe, Kevin said. But we're not hiring a resume. We're hiring a person, and you're the person we want. Patricia pulled out a folder. Let me go over the details. The starting salary is $75,000 a year. Full health benefits that start immediately, including coverage for dependents. We also provide a signing bonus of $5,000 to help with relocation expenses or whatever you need to get settled. David's mind was reeling. $75,000 a year. That was more than he'd made at his old job. Health benefits for Lily. A signing bonus. This couldn't be happening. There's something else, Robert said. We heard about your daughter's medical situation. Our health insurance should cover her ongoing treatments, but I want to make sure there are no gaps. Patricia, can we work with our insurance provider to ensure everything from her recent surgery and follow-ups is covered retroactively? Patricia nodded, already looking into it. We'll get it sorted out. David felt tears welling up in his eyes. He tried to fight them back, but it was useless. I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't feel like enough. You don't need to thank us, Robert said gently. You earned this. Now let's talk about start date. Given your current situation, would you be able to begin next Monday? That gives you a week to get things organized. Yes, David said, his voice thick with emotion. Absolutely yes. They spent the next hour going over paperwork. Employment contracts, tax forms, benefits enrollment, direct deposit information. It all felt surreal, like David was watching it happen to someone else. When he signed the final document, Patricia handed him an envelope. This is an advance on your signing bonus, she said. $2,000 to help you get through the next week. Find a place to live, get some work clothes, whatever you need. The rest will come with your first paycheck. David stared at the envelope. $2,000 cash right now. He'd gone from having $8 to having enough money to completely change his situation. It was too much. It was overwhelming. I need to ask you something, David said suddenly. Why are you doing this? Really. Why take a chance on someone like me? Robert leaned back in his chair. Can I tell you a story? When I was 25, I lost everything in a business venture that went bad. I ended up sleeping in my car for 3 months. I was applying for jobs, but nobody would hire me because I looked like a mess and couldn't afford nice clothes. Then one day, a woman who owned a small manufacturing plant gave me a chance. She said she didn't care what I looked like. She cared about whether I was willing to work hard and learn. He paused, his eyes distant with memory. That woman saved my life. She didn't just give me a job. She gave me back my dignity and my hope. Everything I have now, everything I've built, started because someone looked past my circumstances and saw my potential. I promised myself that if I ever got the chance, I'd do the same thing for someone else. Robert looked directly at David. When I saw you give away your meal to that woman, I saw someone who hadn't let his circumstances destroy his humanity. That's rare. That's valuable. And that's exactly the kind of person I want leading my team. David left the office building in a daze. The envelope with $2,000 felt heavy in his pocket, like it might burn through the fabric and disappear if he didn't hold on to it tight enough. He walked several blocks before the reality of what had just happened finally hit him. Then he stopped right there on the sidewalk, put his hands on his knees, and just breathed. A woman passing by asked if he was okay. David looked up at her and laughed, which probably made him seem crazy, but he didn't care. "I'm better than okay," he said. "I just got a second chance at life." The woman smiled, confused but happy for him, and kept walking. David straightened up and pulled out his phone. It was an old phone, barely working, but it could still make calls. His sister answered on the second ring. "David, is everything okay?" "Better than okay," he said, hearing his voice crack with emotion. "I got a job. A real job. Good pay, benefits, everything. And they're going to help with Lily's medical bills." His sister started crying on the other end of the line. Happy tears. Relieved tears. "Oh, thank God, David, I'm so happy for you. For both of you." "Can I talk to her?" David asked. "Can I tell Lily?" There was rustling on the line, and then his daughter's voice came through. "Daddy? Hey, baby girl. How are you feeling?" "I'm good. I got a gold star on my math test. Are you coming to see me?" "Very soon," David promised. "And I have good news. Really good news. Remember how I told you I was looking for work? Well, I found a job. A really good one. Which means you can come home soon. We'll get our own place again." Lily squealed with excitement. "Really, when? Can I bring all my stuffed animals?" "Every single one," David said, grinning so hard his face hurt. "I need to get some things sorted out this week, but soon. Very soon." After he hung up, David stood there on the sidewalk and just let himself feel it. The relief, the joy, the overwhelming sense that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. He hadn't realized how much weight he'd been carrying until some of it lifted. His shoulders felt lighter. His chest didn't feel so tight, but he couldn't stand around celebrating. He had work to do. The first priority was finding a place to live. He couldn't start a new job while living in a shelter. That wouldn't be fair to anyone. So David started walking, looking for apartment buildings with for rent signs. The first few places he tried were disasters. Either too expensive or they wanted first month, last month, and a security deposit that would eat up all his money. But the sixth place he tried, a small apartment complex on the edge of town, seemed promising. The manager was an older guy named Frank who looked tired but kind. "I've got a one-bedroom available," Frank said. "It's small but clean, $700 a month plus utilities. I need first month and security deposit to move in." David did the math in his head. That would take most of his advance, but he'd have enough left over for some basics. "Can I see it?" The apartment was on the second floor, overlooking a small courtyard. It was tiny, maybe 500 square feet total, but it had a bedroom for Lily, a little kitchen, and a bathroom that worked. The carpet was worn and the walls needed paint, but it was clean and safe. That was what mattered. "I'll take it," David said. Frank looked surprised. "Don't you want to think about it?" "I've been thinking about having a home again for 3 months," David replied. "This is perfect." They went back to the office and David filled out the paperwork. He had to be honest about his recent history. No job, eviction, living in a shelter. He expected Frank to change his mind, but the old man just nodded thoughtfully. "We all hit rough patches," Frank said. "You seem like good people. And you said you start a new job Monday?" "Yes, sir. Plant manager at Chen Industries." Frank's eyebrows went up. "That's a good company. Robert Chen is solid. My nephew works there. If you're working for Robert, that's good enough for me." David handed over $1,400 in cash, first month rent and deposit. Frank counted it carefully, then handed him a set of keys. "Welcome home." Those 2 words hit David harder than he expected. Welcome home. He had a home again, a place where Lily could sleep in her own bed and put her stuffed animals on the shelf. A place where he could close the door and just breathe without worrying about who was watching or judging. The apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no dishes, nothing. But David didn't care. He sat down in the middle of the living room floor and just looked around. It was his. For the first time in months, he had something that belonged to him. He spent the rest of that day at thrift stores and secondhand shops, stretching his remaining money as far as it could go. He found a mattress set for $100, slightly worn but clean. A small kitchen table and 2 chairs for $30. Some plates, cups, and silverware for another $20. Sheets, towels, basic cleaning supplies. By evening, he'd created a modest but functional home. The furniture store agreed to deliver the mattress the next day. David spent that first night sleeping on the floor of his new apartment, using his jacket as a pillow. It was the best sleep he'd had in months. Over the next few days, David prepared for his new job. He bought 2 pairs of decent work pants and 3 button-up shirts from a discount store. Nothing fancy, but professional enough. He got a haircut. He practiced his route to the new facility so he'd know exactly how long the bus ride would take. He also tried to find Rose, the elderly woman from the diner. He went back to that same diner several times, hoping to see her. He asked around at the shelter, describing her to staff members. Nobody had seen her. David left his new contact information with people, asking them to pass it along if they saw a woman matching her description. He wanted to tell her about the job, about how her situation had somehow led to his miracle. On Thursday, David got a call from Patricia in HR. "Good news," she said. "We've worked it out with the insurance company. All of Lily's medical bills from the past 6 months will be covered. You won't owe anything." David had to sit down. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. The bills should be processed within a couple of weeks. Oh, and Robert wanted me to ask if you needed any help moving your daughter back home. He knows a family in the area that might have some kids' furniture they're not using anymore." "That would be incredible," David said. "Thank you. Thank all of you." That weekend, David's sister drove Lily to the new apartment. His daughter burst through the door with her backpack and 2 garbage bags full of stuffed animals, and immediately started talking a mile a minute about where everything should go, and could she paint her room purple, and did they have a TV yet. David just hugged her, breathing in the smell of her strawberry shampoo. "We'll figure it all out, sweetheart, together." His sister helped them get settled. She'd brought some dishes and a lamp and a small TV she wasn't using. Before she left, she hugged David tight. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You never gave up." "I almost did," David admitted. "About 100 times. But you didn't, that's what matters." Monday morning arrived faster than David expected. He got up early, made breakfast for Lily, walked her to the bus stop for school, then caught his own bus to Chen Industries. The facility was impressive, a sprawling complex on the edge of town. Robert met him at the entrance. "Ready for your first day?" Robert asked. "More than ready," David replied. The morning was a whirlwind of orientation. Robert introduced David to what felt like hundreds of people. Production line workers, quality control staff, office personnel. Everyone seemed friendly, if a bit cautious. David understood. They were sizing him up, trying to figure out what kind of boss he'd be. During lunch, Robert took David on a tour of the production floor. "I want to show you something," Robert said. He led David to a wall near the break room. On it were dozens of photos and news clippings. "This is our community wall," Robert explained. "We believe businesses should be part of the communities they serve. So we track our involvement, food drives, school partnerships, scholarship programs. It's not just about making products, it's about making a difference." David studied the photos, workers volunteering at local schools, the company sponsoring a youth soccer team, a big check being presented to a homeless shelter. That last one caught his attention. "Is that the shelter on 5th Street? "It is. We've been supporting them for years." "Why?" David felt a lump in his throat. "That's where I was staying when we met at the diner." Robert nodded. "I know. Patricia mentioned it during your paperwork. Life has a funny way of coming full circle, doesn't it?" The rest of the day was spent learning systems and procedures. David met with department heads, reviewed production schedules, and started getting a feel for how the facility operated. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. He was challenged, engaged, useful again. At the end of the day, Kevin pulled him aside. "Can I give you some advice?" "Please," David said, "be yourself. That's why Robert hired you. Don't try to be someone you're not, or manage the way you think you're supposed to manage. These workers have seen plenty of managers come through. They'll know if you're being fake." David nodded. "I appreciate that. And one more thing," Kevin added. "Welcome to the team. We're glad you're here." Over the next few weeks, David settled into his role. He spent a lot of time on the production floor, talking to workers, learning their names, understanding their challenges. He discovered that one of the biggest complaints was the break room. It was dingy and depressing. So David worked with Linda in community relations to renovate it. They painted the walls, added better lighting, and created a space where people actually wanted to spend their breaks. It was a small thing, but the workers noticed. They started talking to David more, bringing him problems instead of hiding them. Production actually improved because people felt heard and valued. One day, about 6 weeks into the job, David was in his office when Patricia knocked on his door. "Someone's here to see you," she said. "She says her name is Rose." David jumped up so fast he nearly knocked over his coffee. He rushed to the lobby and there she was, the elderly woman from the diner. She looked different, cleaner, healthier. She was wearing nice clothes and had a smile on her face. "Rose," David exclaimed. "I've been trying to find you. How are you? What happened?" Rose's eyes filled with happy tears. "You happened," she said. "After that night at the diner, I couldn't stop thinking about what you did. It gave me courage. I called my son, told him everything. He was devastated that I hadn't reached out sooner. He brought me home, helped me get back on my feet." She pulled out a small envelope. "I wanted to pay you back for that meal." "Absolutely not," David said firmly. "Please." "Then let me pay it forward," Rose said. "I heard from people at the shelter that you work here now, that you're doing well. I'm so happy for you. And I want to help. My son works in education. He heard your company does scholarship programs. We'd like to contribute." 6 months after that first day at Chen Industries, David stood in front of his team at the facility's official opening ceremony. The building was packed with workers, community members, local officials, and business partners. Everyone had come to celebrate the launch of what would become one of the most productive facilities in the region. But the numbers weren't what David was most proud of. Sure, they'd met every production goal. Yes, they'd come in under budget and ahead of schedule. Those things mattered to the people upstairs. What mattered to David was something harder to measure. He'd built a team that actually cared about each other. Workers looked out for one another. When someone was struggling, others stepped in to help. They'd created a culture where people weren't just showing up for a paycheck. They were showing up because they felt like they mattered. As David looked out at the crowd, he spotted familiar faces. There was Robert sitting in the front row with the other executives, Patricia and Kevin and Linda, who'd become more than colleagues. They'd become friends. His sister was there with Lily, who was wearing a new dress and beaming with pride at her dad. And in the back, partly hidden by the crowd, David saw Rose. She'd kept her promise about paying it forward. Her son had connections in the education world, and together they'd helped Chen Industries establish a scholarship fund for children of employees. 3 kids were already benefiting from it, including the daughter of one of David's production line workers who dreamed of becoming a doctor. Robert stepped up to the microphone first, giving the official remarks that executives always gave at these events. But then he did something unexpected. He called David up to share a few words. David hadn't prepared a speech. He'd figured the executives would handle all the talking. But as he stood behind that microphone, looking out at all those faces, he knew exactly what he wanted to say. "About 7 months ago," David began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "I was sitting on a bench outside a homeless shelter with $8 in my pocket. I'd lost everything. My job, my home, my sense of worth. I was 1 meal voucher away from complete desperation. The room had gone completely quiet. People were leaning forward, listening. That night I went to a diner to use that voucher, and I met a woman who had even less than I did. An elderly lady who was asking for just bread and water because she was hungry. Every logical part of my brain told me to ignore her. I needed that food. I was starving. Giving it away would be stupid." David paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I gave her my meal anyway. And I'm not telling you this to make myself sound noble or good. I'm telling you because of what happened next. A man was watching. He saw me give away what I thought was my last meal. And that moment changed everything." He gestured to Robert. "This man didn't just offer me a job. He gave me back my dignity, my hope, my future. He taught me that sometimes the best interviews happen when you don't know you're being interviewed. That character reveals itself in small moments when nobody's watching. Except someone was watching, and it mattered." David looked around the room. "I know some of you are wondering why I'm sharing this story. Here's why. Every single person in this room has the power to change someone's life. Not with grand gestures or huge amounts of money. Just by choosing kindness when it costs you something. By seeing people who've become invisible to everyone else. By giving from an empty cup. He saw people nodding. Some were wiping their eyes. In the past 6 months, I've watched this team become something special. I've seen you support each other. Help each other. Cover for each other when someone's kid is sick or their car breaks down or life just gets overwhelming. You've created a workplace that feels like family, and that's because you understand something important. David's voice grew stronger. We're not just here to make products. We're here to take care of each other. Every person matters. From the newest hire to the oldest veteran. From the executive offices to the loading dock. We're all in this together. He pulled out a small card from his pocket. I keep this on my desk. It's something my mother used to say. When you light someone else's candle, your candle doesn't lose any light. It just makes the room brighter. That's what this place is about. Making the room brighter for everyone. The applause started small but grew until the whole room was standing. David stepped back from the microphone, overwhelmed by the response. Robert stood up and shook his hand, then pulled him into a brief hug. That was perfect, Robert whispered. Thank you. After the ceremony, David mingled with the crowd. Worker after worker came up to thank him or share their own stories. One woman told him how the flexible scheduling policy he'd implemented meant she could finally take night classes. A young guy mentioned that David's mentorship had given him confidence to apply for a supervisor position. Rose found him near the refreshment table. She looked healthier than ever, her eyes bright and clear. That was a beautiful speech, she said. But you didn't mention the most important part of that story. What's that? David asked. That giving me that meal saved your life just as much as it saved mine. Maybe more. David thought about that. She was right. If he'd eaten that meal himself, he would have had a full stomach for a day. But he never would have met Robert. Never would have gotten this job. Never would have rebuilt his life. The act of giving away what he thought he couldn't afford to give had somehow opened doors he didn't even know existed. You're right, David said softly. I think about that a lot. About how close I came to keeping that sandwich. But you didn't, Rose said firmly. You chose to see someone who needed help more than you needed food. That's character. And character always finds a way to create opportunities. In the following weeks, David's story spread beyond the facility. A local news outlet heard about it and wanted to do a feature. David was reluctant at first. He didn't want attention or praise. But Robert convinced him that sharing the story might inspire others. The segment aired on a Friday evening. It showed David at work interacting with his team. It included interviews with Robert, with Rose, with some of the workers. And it told the story of the sandwich that changed everything. The response was overwhelming. The facility received dozens of calls and emails from people sharing their own stories of kindness or asking how they could get involved in the scholarship program. Local businesses wanted to partner on community initiatives. Churches and organizations reached out about volunteer opportunities, but the message that meant the most to David came from a man named Tommy. He sent an email late one night explaining that he'd been fired 2 months ago and was considering giving up. He'd been at a gas station ready to spend his last few dollars on lottery tickets out of pure desperation when he saw the news story on the TV behind the counter.